محمد وآل محمد.
Inshallah, everyone's doing well and slept well. I want to start off by congratulating everyone and doing a marvelous job on cleaning the kitchen after we ate. They said it was very, very good, very tidy. Just one little thing that they mentioned was the sweeping wasn't done, but other than that, everything was good. So that's the only thing we need to add, and it'll be perfect. Today we're going to talk about identity, right? It's always an elusive topic, and a lot of us go through it. Actually, everyone goes through it, trying to find who your identity is or what your identity is. A lot of us come as immigrants, okay, and we have an Islam that's sort of cultural by nature, and so that forms a large part of our identity. And for some people, it's the other way around, where they have a certain culture within North America, and then let's say they revert to Islam, and then they have this identity crisis of, who am I? Am I North American? Am I Muslim? As if they're mutually exclusive. When in reality, you can bring everything together. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Today is not about answers. It's not about me telling you guys what it is or who your identity is. It's about introspection. It's about thinking within yourself. Okay? And there's going to be a lot of interaction, a lot of dialogue. So the more you guys talk, the more everyone's going to benefit. Okay? So I start with a little disclaimer. Whenever we talk about identity, always important to say that identity is a personal issue. We don't mean to offend anyone, and so everyone needs to come in with open hearts and try and sort of extract whatever people are trying to say in terms of the morals, and if anything is said that's borderline, we'll try and guide it so that it doesn't reach that way. So, who are you? Right? All of you have a piece of paper. Inshallah, everyone has a piece of paper. And I hope you guys have pens. If you don't, you could share the pen between you. And I want you to write down who you are. You could write it in a word, you could write it in a phrase, you can write it in a few phrases. Basically sum up. If you wanted to go and explain to someone that has no clue who you are, you're just going to write down who you are to that person. So, go ahead. We're going to get back to them a little later on, okay? So for right now, just have them there. We're going to start talking about identity, okay? But to have a meaningful conversation about what identity is, we can't start from zero because we already have preconceived notions of what identity is, right? So we have to start from below. So in order to do that, we're going to try and break down whatever we have that isn't true about identity. So I would like to ask you first, what does not form a part of your identity? So, who has anything to say about that?
How wealthy you are.
How wealthy you are, okay.
Status.
Status. Does everyone agree? You don't have to agree with that statement. So I guess there is agreement.
I guess anything that doesn't stay with you forever is not part of your identity.
Okay. Anything that doesn't stay with you. Okay, so that's a big statement. Okay. Anyone want to break it down to what doesn't stay with you? Or do you guys agree?
Can we open the air condition?
Yes, you may. Yes, you may.
Is this part of your identity?
For now, yes.
One over there and one over here. Yeah.
I think identity is everybody defines it a little bit more, so it's kind of more personal.
Yeah.
So somebody might not, think that money is part of their identity, but somebody else might think it is.
Okay. Very good point. Okay. So now we have something that doesn't stay, not wealth, but then another opinion that it can be wealth, it can be these things that stay, that don't stay, because different people have different identities. Okay. It changes over time.
Doesn't stay. So maybe for instance your wealth, that's your identity, then it's your your way you dress. So it's not something that
Great point. Okay, so it doesn't stay. It changes with time. Does everyone agree with that?
I define identity as a dunya.
Okay.
So everything in dunya is identity. At the end, we all come back to the same location. That's the definition of identity.
Okay, so we have a definition over here as dunya. I sort of wanted to get away from what it is and try to focus what it isn't. Okay? So let's try and bring it back to there. What is it not? Okay? Anyone have an idea what it isn't?
when you say that your identity, are you talking like plural, like in general, or like personally what's not part of your identity?
Could be either.
Because I don't think they can kind of specify sort of list or criteria for everyone. Like the sister mentioned, you can't sort of like put it in a box and like this is what falls under my like, your identity.
Great point. Yeah. So she said that whether the question was implying the plural you as everyone or you in specific. She said there isn't one sort of definition or one box that you could put everyone in and out of what is and isn't identity. And it sort of supports what the sister was saying earlier. So.
Yeah, I believe that everything forms your identity. I don't think there is something that doesn't make you who you are, because everything you do, everything you believe in, all your thoughts, what you do, you know, like your status, everything is part of your identity. So I don't think anything doesn't form your identity.
Okay. So we got everything on this one. So by that you mean that nothing is not part of your identity?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
And I guess to define identity, it also depends on how other people perceive us, how they identify us. It's not only what we consider our own.
Great point. Great point. Go ahead.
I think what the sister said previously, it's true. I think the only things that don't form your identity are things that you do not have in mind, or that you do not necessarily practice. As long as it becomes part of your practice, or becomes part of your mind, it will influence you, and it will lead to that identity that you have. Maybe not as strong as other factors, but it will have an influence.
Okay. So we have another support for the everything idea.
I'll just nuance that. Identity is not finite. You can't really say this, and this is part of my identity, because down the road you might realize that you actually identify with things even if you're not aware of it.
Okay. Okay. So down the road, so you're saying that it also evolves with time?
Yes, I believe.
Okay, so we got another support for that one.
I think things that don't form a part of your identity are things that are common between like everybody.
Yeah.
So like, you know, the fact that we're all human, like people wouldn't really consider that part of their identity because it's just a given.
Yeah.
Like, you know, the fact that we just eat, like that's a given. That we
Yeah.
sleep, that's a given. So things like that don't really form part of your identity. Only when they become a little bit more unique towards you, they start to form like you.
Yeah. Okay.
I think being a mother, father, daughter, that's not part of your identity. That's just a role you play for a function.
So I have a question that I want to field right now, and I want to see by a show of hands. Okay. Who considers themselves to be a Canadian Muslim, and who considers themselves to be a Muslim in Canada? So, Canadian Muslim or a Muslim in Canada? Now, sorry?
What's your definition?
It doesn't matter the definition. Which do you feel closer? Like if I were to identify with you, Or if you were to tell me who you are you a Muslim in Canada or are you a Canadian Muslim?
Right now it means the same.
It means the same? Okay. So a Canadian Muslim would have Canadian within it sort of an adjective to Muslim, right?
No, I know what you're saying, but to me it's interchangeable.
Okay, so we'll start a third group then. Interchangeable group.
Wait, I have another group. Like, you're saying Canadian Muslim. What about Muslim Canadian? Like, is it priority Muslim first and then Canadian?
Muslim Canadian?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess so. Okay. So 4 groups now. I didn't anticipate this, but so we have Canadian Muslim, Muslim Canadian, interchangeable,
The Muslim in Canada.
and Muslim in Canada. Okay, so we'll start with Muslim in Canada. Raise hands. Got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Wow, okay. Okay, and now the next one was Canadian Muslim. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Now, Muslim Canadian. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, 7. And last but not least, interchangeable. Oh. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay. Interesting. The majority thought that they were Muslims in Canada. Yeah. Does anyone want to explain why they felt that way, or for any of the other ones, why they felt particular to that option? Go ahead.
Well, I think you can say Canadian Muslim, because if you say Muslim in Canada, because like back home when you come and visit your country, they throw a crown which is kind of derogatory. It's like, hey, you became Canadian. Like in a sense, like you gave up your pride of your old country, your culture, and like they give you this thing like now you're disrespectful, now you're like white, and it's just so that's why I rather prefer myself as a Muslim in Canada than to be called a Canadian Muslim. So that
That's
was the main reason.
an excellent point, and we are going to get into that a little later on. You can't hear me? We'll tend to identify less with Canadian and more with Muslim, so Muslim in Canada. And so that's the opinion. Whether it's right or wrong, that's what he said.
I mean, I identify myself as being Canadian Muslim, but I chose that way because, like, being born in Canada and living in Canada, you kind of like subconsciously pull like, different characteristics that may apply to, like, if you're born here, it's like really different than if you're born back home, kind of thing. So like you pull the characteristics of being Canadian rather than when it comes to being Muslim. Like that's more of by choice rather than subconscious. Like we choose to be Muslim, we choose to practice Islam and whatnot, but we don't choose to integrate like Canadian culture. It just kind of happens.
Good point.
Yeah, well, I feel like Canada has a lot of different people. It's multicultural, and being a Muslim is what makes me different from all of the Canadians that are here.
Okay. Good point. So, would you have something you want to say?
I consider myself a Canadian Muslim because I don't feel like Islam has anything to do with the Arab culture. It's a lifestyle, it's what you choose or choose not to do. It's more of like what you think is right and wrong. You can love the sustenance and maple syrup and still be a great Muslim, you know what I mean? So I think I'm a Canadian Muslim.
You're French Canadian. She's a French Canadian.
If it's anyone that has like a loud voice. You don't really need to wait for them.
So I consider myself a Muslim in Canada because I feel like Canada doesn't have an identity. So I said that I consider myself a Muslim in Canada because I don't know what Canada's identity is, because it's such a mixed salad or a mosaic, as one of the sisters also mentioned. It's the thing that makes it unique from others. Whereas if we talk about now the West we can't really generalize that much either, because even in every European country they have different cultures. And in the States, it's a melting pot. So I can't assimilate into the melting pot, but then when I come to Canada, it's the mixed salad. Yet that doesn't have an identity. Even Canadians admit it themselves. Unless they're born here and they're generations here, and they're white, then they're Canadian. Seriously, in all honesty. Even Chinese and Indians and Hojas who've been here for decades don't consider themselves Canadian. And if they do, they can't define what a Canadian is because it's so diverse. And that's the beauty of Canada. I feel like Canada is a country, but not a culture. It has no culture. It has certain aspects that are cultural, but in terms of, it doesn't have, I can't define what Canadian culture is. If you consider maple syrup Canadian culture, fine, but I think there's more to Iraqi culture or Lebanese culture or Pakistani culture than our food, right? So that's why I feel like Canada doesn't have a set culture. That's why I'd identify with being Muslim in Canada.
Okay. That is a good point, and again, we will touch on that a little later on.
Still, there's some points here.
Some boys.
So I think one of the sisters also mentioned, I think I'm loud enough, no?
It's better.
So I think one of the sisters also mentioned this in relation to that. I think being born with, well, you're not born with identity necessarily, but having a family that as soon as you're born, give you that identity or pass it on to you has a big influence on what you identify yourself as. So she mentioned, interesting, that she was born in Canada, and that's what she feels like a Canadian Muslim. For me, I was born in Iran, but then I had the Muslim identity when I was growing up. So maybe I identify with that more. And with the Canadian culture that you mentioned, I think it kind of goes back to the family. I don't think that like my family necessarily. And my sister also mentioned that she finds herself to be a Muslim Canadian, and I feel the same way. And I think it goes back to the family itself. I don't think our families tell us that we're Canadians. And therefore, family has a big impact on what you find yourself to be like, or what you identify yourself with. So in that sense, I think that's one of the reasons why some of us might find ourselves to be Muslim Canadians, just because there is no focus on the Canadian culture. I think Canada does have a culture. And I think if you ask Canadians, they would be able to tell you more about the Canadian culture than what I may know, just because I haven't been told about it, or there hasn't been a pressure, for instance, for me to follow that specific culture.
Kind of excludes ourselves from where we are in, which is in Canada. Most of us have been here for 15, 20, 25 years. And I think we're part of that society. When we exclude ourselves, we could kind of always put ourselves in a corner and feel that we don't belong and we should not really change anything in this society. But when we feel we're Canadian Muslim, we feel that we belong to this society and we can do something. We can change Canadians, which are either Christian or atheist, to become Muslim. And they're also going to be Canadian Muslims. That's one point. The other point I want to say is, when you say you're a Muslim in Canada, it implies that you're a Muslim something in Canada. You're Muslim Iraqi, you're Muslim Lebanese in Canada. Meaning you're still going to identify with another country. But in reality, if you've been living here for 20 years, 25 years, and you go back to your original country, chances are you will not feel the same as the people that are in that country for all their lives. So you won't even tell yourself that I'm a Lebanese, like typical Lebanese Muslim. You're not really, that's my opinion, you're not really just a Lebanese Muslim. You could be if you are a Lebanese or Iraqi or Pakistani Muslim, then you really like the people that live there all their life. But I at least don't feel, and I'm originally from Iraq, I don't feel I'm a typically Iraqi Muslim. I'm more like a Canadian Muslim. And Islam and the nationality, they don't oppose each other. You can be a Canadian Muslim, American Muslim. They come together. They don't oppose each other. So it doesn't make my Islam secondary if I'm Canadian Muslim. My Islam really identifies who I am within myself, but the culture and the values and which country or which place I can make a change and I can, do some effect on is in Canada.
So I guess this is a very difficult question. Actually, it's quite a difficult one, and I just had to share some thoughts. That's all I can do. As you said, it's hard to answer this question. There's a lot of feelings as well. You might basically say, I want to call myself Canadian Muslim because I don't want to isolate myself and then give off this negative PR, and then feel that you're a Muslim in Canada because that's really how you feel, right? Or you might be, saying the opposite. Not that one is right and one is wrong. And somebody might feel that I'm a Canadian Muslim, another might not, depending on their experiences. But I should just share some thoughts, basically. Let's take a look at the Prophet we have one, actually. You know how we call the Prophet? We say, Al-Nabi al-Ummi, Al-Hashimi, Al-Qurashi, and I think we say Al-Madani as well, Al-Makki also, right? So what's all this, right? The Prophet, peace be upon him. Now this is what someone named him. Is this part of text that we can take as like divine? I'm not sure. So I don't want to build something that this is what God says. This is just how we call him. But it's interesting because he's a Nabi, he's an Ummi, which Nabi, the Prophet Ummi, meaning that he's the person who essentially comes from the nation. The Arabs were called Ummi, okay, because they came from the mother town, which is Mecca. Some people say illiterate or unlettered, but the Arabs were called as Al-Ummi because they were from the mother town of Arabia, which was Mecca. It was the mother town of that place, the mother city, right? Then Hashimi, because he's from the tribe of Hashim. Does he have feelings towards his tribe? Yes. Does he identify with that? Yes. Right? He's also Hashimi. When he started off, under Ashiratak al-Aqrabun, when the Prophet told him, when Allah told him, go see the near ones, he didn't go to, he went to Bani Hashim. Right? Those are the people that are near him that he identifies. So he's Hashimi, he's from that city. Then after that, Makki, right? He's from Mecca. And we know that when he went to Medina, the Ansar told the Prophet, he said, so now that you're going to open Mecca again, are you going to go back to Mecca and forget about us? He said, I'm never leaving, right? I'm staying in Medina, and he was buried in Medina. And now Medina is called Al-Madina al-Munawwara of Medina al-Rasul. Whereas he was an immigrant to that Medina, right? It's like, wow, so what is he? Where are you? Are you Madani? Are you from Yathrib, Mecca? Which one? It's clear that he's from all of them. But it's clear that his story he has connections with all of them. And I feel the same way about myself. Last year, I'm born in Iran, right? I'm born in Iran, not last year. But I'm born in Iran, okay? I grew up opening my eyes to what the Muslims had done there, irrespective of whether it was perfectly right or perfectly wrong or whatever you have your opinion. But there were sincere people that are Iranian that did amazing things for us that we should learn from and study from their strengths and their weaknesses. That's part of my identity. I lived in Lebanon. I come from South Lebanon. I'm a Shia Muslim, right? That's my story. If you tell me about, how the Shias were persecuted for their love of Ahlul Bayt, something happens in my heart. because it's part of my story. My grandfather would have been that. My great-grandfather was, having no job because he loved Ahlul Bayt. That's part of my story, right? I can't just say it. How am I going to disconnect from that? And if I can pass it down to my kids, it'll be part of their story too. Depends on how much I talk to them about it. If they see it, if they experience it. What else? I live in Canada. When I went to the Middle East for Hajj, right? I felt like I was gonna puke at the things that I saw from these so-called Arabs. My stomach was like, it was like kind of turning. The inequality between men and women, the corruption, this twisted upside down religion, right? What is that? That's not me. So definitely this is not me. I can't accept it. Whereas my heart palpitates when I hear about the Ahlul Bayt and the story of the Shia who loved them, or the story of those who resisted Israel who was occupying our land. My heart palpitates for that, but my stomach starts turning when I see how people are behaving in so-called Arab countries. Equality, this is an Islamic idea, it's there in Canada. When I come to Canada, I like how they do things here. I like listening to some of the art that is available here. Do I appreciate it? Yes. I appreciate some of the North American or Western art. I can understand it, I can feel it, right? So, do I know how to talk to people here? Yes. Do I know how people think? Yes. But am I Canadian? Well, the Canadians don't think I'm Canadian, right? So that plays a role too. In 100 years, if we start being part of society and building and clearly being part of it, which is what we need to do, then that might change, and then I start feeling like I'm Canadian. I went to Lebanon. It was the first place in the world that I didn't need any papers. That made me feel good. I felt like I belonged. So it was something somebody else did, right? So it's very complicated. So that's why, for me, those things are just a story. They're just a story. It's my story. You ask me what's my story. Don't ask me what's my identity. Ask me what my story is, and I will tell you what are the different things that make me who I am today. But I can't put it in a box. Whereas Islam, whereas being a Muslim, that's the constant. Why am I Shia? Because it was being a Muslim. It meant to be Shia. Why am I resisting Israel? Because they were occupying our land. It wasn't theirs, and I have to defend myself as a Muslim. Why do I appreciate equality that is there in Canada, and my stomach turns when I see the opposite in my countries? Because Islam calls for justice, and that's what's ultimately human, right? So it's so hard to actually put. People like it. People like for me to put a color, and let's be Canadian, or let's the Canadians might like to hear that I want to be Canadian, or vice versa. But if I want to be true to myself, and it's a richness. So there's multiple identities, if you want to call it like that. It's a story. Just some thoughts, but no answer, I don't think.
Okay, great. So we just got no identity.
When I'm in Canada, I feel like I'm a Muslim in Canada. When I'm with people outside Canada, if I visit my family outside, I would consider myself to be Canadian Muslim. Because I compare it to them, I'm more Canadian. But when I'm in Canada, I don't really identify myself. Like, if I introduce myself to someone and I feel like I'm Muslim Canadian, they'd be like, yeah, but originally from where? That's the next question, usually. But when you go outside in Canada, I would feel like, no, I still have Canadian things of culture that I carry with me.
So it's probably like what the sister said about distinguishing yourself more. Within here, there's multiculturalism, there's all sorts of Canadians, so to distinguish yourself, you're a Muslim in Canada. And when you go over there to distinguish yourself, there's a lot of Muslims, you become the Canadian Muslim.
Not necessarily.
No?
It's just like, okay, when I'm in Canada, I don't feel like, I'm part of this group really Canadian. When I go outside of Canada, like let's say the Middle East or anything, I still don't feel like I'm part of that group. I'm more Canadian. So it's like you're lost in between. You're both, and you're not any at the same time.
That's a very good point.
I just wanted to add to that, going back to why I brought up the next category. I think it depends on who your audience is and who you're talking to. If you're talking to somebody here within Canada, then yeah, maybe you want to say you're a Muslim Canadian or you're a Muslim in Canada. Again, I think it's all interchangeable. If you're going back home, wherever you're from, then you want to emphasize that you're Canadian. So
yeah, fair enough.
be great.
So we're gonna just a few more people to talk because we want to continue as well. So
A lot of people have been saying that Canada doesn't have a culture, but on a daily basis, I think it does. Canadian culture is saying, oh, hey, let's go have a beer after work, or accepting homosexuality. And so for these reasons, there will always be certain values that contradict Islam's teachings. And now we can always remove ourselves from these things, but then we end up window shopping our lives in Canada. And for that reason, I'd say I'm a Muslim in Canada. But at the same time, when I think about it, I might be stuck in between the two, interchangeable, that last option, because when I do go abroad, it immediately say where you're from, I resort back to Canada, not where origin or Iraq.
that's a great point. Okay, so I guess two more comments.
Well, what I think it's kind of a problem in our era of time because there's too much tension. So the human being now in era of, especially immigrants, they have to justify themselves, and Muslims also. But if we think human being is like a fingerprint, everybody has his own so generic where he comes from, like a ma'dan, like your heritage. They have plenty of things. Even like let's say an example of in my family, people are a little bit nervous. I saw that on my father and on my brother. And when I went back home this last summer, it was so weird. I saw my cousin acting the same way, doing the same way. The thing is, what is unfortunate is that the fact people, here when it comes to identity, wherever it is work or a set of law that makes the society functions, people will follow. But when it comes to belief, because there's certain things that you can share with them, and especially with values, then they put you on a side. And it is the same thing back home also. They have certain values that you can, let's say when you have like a kind of, sort of, what do you call it? Humanity, like the humanity side out of you say, no, okay. When you try to defend certain Canadians that you have met in your life, it's like, yes, they have nice people there, they're not all kafir, they do good, many things like that. I think what I believe, I find a human being ansari, which means his races of his own, like kind of, like in nature, you know what I mean? If he doesn't apply Islam or religion, like especially Islam, because Islam, this is the things that unify us. And again, this sab'a samawati sab'a al-aradi, like even those continents, this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created for us. In the meanwhile, it's important to any place that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, any place that Allah, they have the Quran or this, whatever it is, the Islamic country, it is important to protect it. Why? Because I don't think there's a better law that helps a human being to function and to live in harmony together, other than Islam. So as they have jihad al-nafs, and then you have jihad al-badani, which is of the body. So the body belongs to the continent, and the soul belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is just what I find. It goes back of what Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and Imam Ali alayhi salam has said to us. Like you follow a human being, is your brother either from Islam. If it is not from Islam, is from faith. If it is not from faith, then from humanity.
I would say that I'm a Muslim Canadian because here in Canada we always put Islam first, and anything that we want to pick up from the culture, Islam is the one that's going to be like, this is right, this is wrong, this is what we pick up, this is what we're going to ignore. country is in the Middle East. That's the issue. That's what distinguishes us from Middle Eastern Muslims, because in the Middle East, culture and religion are always intertwined. I mean, there's no clear boundary between what is cultural and what is religious. But here, we practice in our faith. We actually practice the faith, I think, aside from any influences of culture I mean, I feel, this is what I feel like when I compare myself to a family in the Middle East, I actually feel like I'm more religious than them. Not to be not humble or anything, but I feel like a lot of things that they pick up is actually cultural. It's not religious. And when you come to debate these things with them, you see how they can't actually distinguish what is religious and what is cultural. It's all merged in their head. We can't. So I think that's why I see myself as Muslim Canadian, not a Canadian Muslim.
Very valid. Can't really talk about one comment was that, you know, you can't really talk about identity. Another comment's like, you know, they're sort of interchangeable. You can't really, you know, there is that that frustration among us all, because we're all in that struggle, right? We're all trying to find out who we are, and so it's actually very normal and it's very healthy. If one person said, this is exactly my identity, boom, 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 then you got to get a little nervous, like, what's going on here? How does this person know everything about their life, you know? So it is normal, but, and the beauty of being moderator, I get to talk last. It doesn't mean that my opinion is, you know, above yours, but we can also debate it at the end. We look in the past, we have a few examples in terms of identifying ourselves with the country or with other things. One example that comes to mind is the early Muslims. Okay? Now, Islam, when it first arrived, it was in Arabia. And you had the Muslims that had their own culture, that had their own way of interpreting things, of seeing things, of eating, of clothing, and they took on Islam. Okay? So that became Islam. Later on, Islam expanded very, very quickly. And what we notice from history, when we look at all the different Muslim countries, they didn't adopt exactly the same culture. They had their own cultures. And that was perfectly okay at that time. People dressed differently, people ate differently, people spoke differently, but they were Muslim. Okay? And a great example that we see is when we look at in modern day Spain, in the area of Andalus, we saw a totally different culture, and a vibrant culture at that. But it was different. It was very different than the Arab culture. Yet it was Muslim. So it's just food for thought that it could be possible that we're on that cusp as well. We're in a new territory. We're bringing Islam to a new country. And part of our struggle is we're trying to figure out, wait a minute, what is Muslim, what is cultural, what is Lebanese, what is Iraqi, what is Pakistani, what is this, what is that? And we need to integrate it, okay? Now that's a theory. I remember I was listening to Khalil Jafar once saying that there was a problem within the Khoja community once they migrated into Africa, and what they were doing was they had their own identity, right? They were Khoja and that's it, right? They didn't integrate into the broader culture. And so what happened afterwards was when the Africans decided they wanted to take back control of the whole country, it was easy to kick them out because they knew that's Khoja, that's not Khoja, that's Khoja, that's not Khoja, you know, out, in. So, you know, part of being Muslim is it seems to be able to integrate, as the examples that we saw earlier. Now, within the West, okay, what's going on in the West with Islam? The first Muslims that came here were African. So they were, that was the face of Islam. So if you go back in time and you ask people about Islam, it was the African American, African Canadian, right? And who they're sort of the person they were opposed to was the white man. Okay? So you had Muslims and they identified as Muslims, and when people think of Islam, they think opposition to white man, right? With time, that's changed. And now if you look at Africans, they're more integrated within society. But now, what do we classify as Muslim? So if I were to pick a random guy across the street and say, who's a Muslim? What would they say? They'd probably say the immigrants, right? Because today that's the way we see Muslims, as immigrants. And the immigrants, if you go back to their land, who's the sort of the antagonist? It's the West, right? So if you go to all these Muslim countries, they'll tell you the West is this, the West is that, the West is bad, the West is this, you know? So now we move to the West, and we're faced with an interesting dilemma, okay? Some of us are Western. Some of us identify as Western. Yet we identify as the antagonist? Wait a minute. If Islam antagonizes the West, and we identify with the West, which gets back to your point, with when you go back home and people saying, oh, you're Canadian, and it's almost as if it's a contradiction to Islam. So that is something we need to be aware of, right? And that is something that we go through. So let's get back to identity now, okay? And what is our identity? And as you can see, and from the comments, you guys nailed it, okay? It is confusing, right? There isn't one definition for identity. And that's why we didn't start with definition of identity. We wanted to start with definition of what isn't identity, but we sort of went in reverse. But that's okay. Identity is also fluid. It changes with time. It evolves, okay? And for each person, it's different. So one person may identify one thing, another person will identify another thing. So now's the point where we get back to the pieces of paper that we each wrote. So I'm going to give us an example. My name is Mustafa Taha. I'm 23 years old. I was born in California, but I was raised in Montreal. I'm studying dentistry at McGill, my second year. I have 3 brothers, each one born in a different place. My eldest was born in the UAE, myself in the US, my younger brother in the UK, and my youngest brother in Canada. So every day when we meet for dinner, it's like a meeting of the United Nations. Okay? So, now taking that statement, okay, I had to introduce myself, and this is what I thought I was. This is the way I wanted people to see me. So we break it down. Of course, I mean, regardless, I mean, we're not going to get into whether it's a good identity or a bad identity, right? Obviously, things have changed since then, but that's what I wrote. You break it down, you have certain parameters, right? You have Mustafa Taribi, right? So I said that's my name. So identify with my name, okay? Some people won't. Some people will introduce themselves as something else and won't say their name. Who knows? Nationality, okay? Right away, I identified myself as a Canadian, as an American. That's what I identified with. Status, student, dentist, family, brothers, and humor. There was a joke at the end. So that is my identity, right? That is what I felt like I wanted everyone to know, and that's the way. Some people, if they wanted to write something, they would have written a joke. They were just serious about it. And that was because they didn't want to identify with being a joke maker. So on. Now, what is the importance of all this? Okay? You could see these as being the teeth, and excuse the pun, the teeth of a key, right? So everyone has a key, which is their identity, okay? And there's a door somewhere around there in the universe that's your purpose, okay? You alone can open that door because you have the key, which is your unique identity. It's a unique formula of all the different things that make you you, okay? And so you need to find that door, and you need to try in that key, and you need to use every part of your identity to open that door, because that's your purpose, okay? Now this changes. Your key changes with time. So maybe the door that you're supposed to go through, the key today doesn't fit. So maybe you have to change, maybe it's, you know, you'll evolve, and one day, you keep your eyes open, one day that door will present itself. And everyone will know when that door presents itself. And every part of them, every unique part of them, will make them most apt to open that door, and not anyone else. Which gets back to another point. The other point is, should we change our identity because, quote unquote, some people are better, right? So you see, let's say someone comes and they give a wonderful sermon, or they do something amazing, and you're totally amazed by this. Or someone is a professional athlete, and they come and you see the amount of power that they possess, and like they could do whatever they want, right? And then in your mind you're like, that's what I gotta do. That is what I gotta do, because that's what that's the way I can fulfill my purpose. When in reality, no. Every person has different aptitudes. Every person was built a certain way, born a certain way, and born in a certain place. And every person can open a door that the other person can't. So whoever this person is, be it a professional athlete, be it a zillionaire, be it whatever, they have doors that they can open, but they probably can't open the door that you can open. Okay? So it's really important to nurture your identity. Okay? Regardless of what it is, we realize that there is differences, right? Different people identify with different things. Canadian Muslim, Muslim Canada. But you need to nurture that, okay? Because that's who you are. Now, with regards to the purpose, right? So we're always going to say, okay, so how do I know what it is? There was a study that was done in Northeastern University, and by Dr. Hugh Moorhead, okay? And he basically surveyed 250 people at cutting edge of their fields. These were philosophers, religious people, whatever. And at the end, what he concluded from his study was that no one really knew what the purpose was, right? So they were like, a lot of them just spoke a lot of things, but to know what the purpose is, they didn't know, okay? Now he had his own ways of evaluating it, and I won't get into that, but what I will get into is that for us to find our purpose, it's important that we establish a relationship with God, okay? So once we have our identity, we have that relationship with God, then we'll know what that door is that we need to open, okay? And to establish that relationship, it's like we spoke about earlier, those that were fortunate enough to come to the Quran gathering, you need to establish that relationship with the Quran. So, I'm going to read two verses, and we'll comment on it in a second. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ووهبنا لداود سليمان نعم العبد إنه أواب. And to David we gave Solomon, an excellent servant. Indeed, he was one repeatedly turning back to Allah. So, if we take that for a second and we think about it, God is giving, he could have given any attribute to the prophet, right? And in this case, he decided to say he's an excellent servant, which is, who wouldn't want to be an excellent servant, right? An excellent servant. And what was the trait that he gave him? He said, he was one repeatedly turning back. Innahu awwab. Okay? And we'll dissect that word awwab a little later on, similar to the way we dissected it during the Quran gathering. The second ayah that I wanted to tell you guys was أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وخذ بيدك ضغطا فاضرب به ولا تحنث إنا وجدناه صابرا نعم العبد إنه أواب. Same thing, again, awab, that same word. We said, and take your hand a bunch of grass and strike with it, and do not break your oath. Indeed, we found him patient, and an excellent servant. Indeed, he was one repeatedly turning back to Allah. So, again, excellent servant, repeatedly turning back to Allah. So there's a connection there. It's more than once that was said. If we take the word awab, so those are the ayahs. And to David we gave Solomon, an excellent servant. Indeed, he was one repeatedly turning back. So there's excellent servant and repeatedly turning back. And the next one, again, we said, and take in your hand a bunch of grass and strike with it, and do not break your oath. Indeed, we found him patient, an excellent servant. Indeed, he was one repeatedly turning back to Allah. Now that word awab, okay? If we want to be that excellent servant, we need to know what awab is, and we need to be awab, okay? So there, when we spoke about the Lane Lexicon, this is what the Lane Lexicon had to say about the word awab. Lane Lexicon is basically an English dictionary, Arabic English, right? So if you look at those definitions, there are recurring themes, but each one is a different flavor. So let's take the first one, frequent in returning, okay? Which is, it can mean returning to anything, right? Second one, frequent in returning unto God, which is the one that was in the translation that we just read. Frequent in repenting, okay? So that's different one. Frequent praiser of God. Obedient. One who reflects upon his sins in solitude and praises God to forgive them. One who keeps or is mindful of the ordinances prescribed by God and does not rise from his sitting place until he begs forgiveness of God. Okay? Now, if you look at those last two, they're somewhat different. Okay? But there is among all of them that notion of repetitiveness. Right? It's not something stationary. It's something that you're continuously doing. Right? Frequent returning to God. Frequent repenting. Frequent praiser of God. Okay? So there's that continuity. You're continuously doing this. And there's the reflection aspect. Okay? You need to always think about what's going on. You need to reflect. And that's part of being a Muslim. Okay? We see that the Prophet, even before he became a Muslim, he used to go on his own and reflect. And all the prophets were similar. They had their own time where they reflected on their actions, on society, on everything. And that's very, very important. In today's society, it's all about productivity. It's all about, okay, how can we fill our time as best as possible? Yet, what we see here is, no, you have to take some time off. You need to think, okay? And that's what's great about this camp. It's that opportunity. So, alhamdulillah, we can make use of that. Now, I did want to show you a video, okay? And that video is about an American guy. He's part of this organization called Ta'if, and what he describes is a little different than what we're talking about, but it's along the same lines. So what he's talking about, he is a revert, and he's describing the struggle that reverts go with regards to their identity, because they have a certain identity. They identify themselves as, let's say, someone who likes to do skateboarding, someone who likes to eat pizza, and then once they get into Islam, it's almost like they tell them, oh, all that, this is haram, this is haram, this is haram, this is haram. So it's as if he's changing his whole identity based on that one thing, which is Islam, which is noble, yet sometimes it's also cultural, right? So he's going to describe that. And the reason why I bring it up is because it's beneficial for us, because we sort of go through that same struggle.